What's that supposed to be? Some kind of Boy Scout badge? The voice cut through the humid Georgia air like a blade, sharp with the kind of arrogance that only comes from youth and a little bit of authority. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane stood with his arms crossed, his Delta Force patch gleaming on his sleeve, a smirk playing across his face as he stared down at the old man sitting quietly on the wooden bench outside the base commissary. The old man didn't flinch. He just continued eating his sandwich, his weathered hands steady despite the tremor of age. On his left forearm, barely visible beneath the sleeve of his worn flannel shirt, was the edge of a faded tattoo. It was simple, unremarkable to most eyes. A small anchor surrounded by what looked like rope, the ink blurred by decades of sun and time. Kane stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. Behind him, two other operators from his unit watched with the casual interest of predators observing prey. They were fresh from a successful mission overseas, their confidence sky high, their respect for anything that didn't wear their uniform virtually non-existent. "Sir, this is a restricted area," Kane said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "The commissary patio is for active duty personnel and their families only. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." The old man looked up then, his pale blue eyes meeting Kane's dark ones. There was no fear there, no anger, just a quiet patience that seemed to stretch back through decades. He took another bite of his sandwich, chewed slowly, and swallowed before speaking. "My grandson works here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "He's meeting me for lunch." Kane's smirk widened. "Your grandson, huh? What's he do, mop floors? Because unless he's got some serious rank, you're still trespassing on a military installation." The other operators chuckled, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls of the nearby buildings. The base was busy around them, soldiers and civilians moving with purpose, but this little drama was beginning to draw attention. A few people slowed their pace, curious about the confrontation unfolding on the commissary patio. The old man's name was William Foster, though he hadn't been called by his full name in years. Most people just called him Bill or Pop, or in some circles, simply the old-timer. He was 78 years old, his back slightly stooped from decades of hard work, his hands scarred from a lifetime of fixing things that others couldn't. He lived alone in a small house just outside the base, close enough to hear the morning réveillé, far enough away to avoid the noise of training exercises. He had come to the base today, as he did every Tuesday, to have lunch with his grandson Tommy, a young sergeant who worked in the motor pool. It was a tradition they'd maintained for 3 years now, ever since Tommy had been stationed here. Bill would drive his old pickup truck through the gates, show his dependent ID to the guards, and make his way to the commissary where he'd wait patiently for his grandson to finish his morning duties. But today was different. Today, these 3 operators had decided he didn't belong. "Look," Kane said, his voice growing harder, "I don't know what kind of operation you think you're running here, but this isn't a retirement home. This is a United States military installation, and you're making our people uncomfortable." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigarette. A few of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and unease. They could see the old man was no threat, could see the quiet dignity in his posture. But they also recognized the authority in Kane's voice, the weight of his uniform and his rank. Bill finished the last bite of his sandwich and carefully folded the wax paper it had been wrapped in. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He tucked the paper into his jacket pocket, then looked back up at the 3 operators standing over him. "I served too," he said simply. Kane let out a short, barking laugh. Yeah, I'm sure you did, Pops. What was it, Vietnam? Korea? Let me guess, you were a cook or a supply clerk, right? He gestured dismissively at Bill's civilian clothes, his worn work boots, his humble appearance. This isn't a VFW meeting. This is an active military base with active military personnel doing active military work. The insult was clear, wrapped in the thin veneer of military courtesy, but sharp enough to cut. Kane was establishing a hierarchy, putting the old man in his place, demonstrating to his fellow operators and the growing crowd of onlookers that he was in control of this situation. But Bill just nodded, as if he'd expected this response. He'd heard it before, in different forms, from different people. The assumption that age meant irrelevance, that civilian clothes meant civilian service, that quiet dignity meant weakness. He'd learned long ago not to take it personally. The second operator, a lean man with sergeant's stripes named Rodriguez, stepped forward. His voice was slightly less harsh than Kane's, but no less dismissive. Sir, we appreciate your service, whatever it was. But regulations are regulations. This area is restricted, and without proper authorization, you need to leave. The third operator, Corporal Jackson, remained silent but alert, his hand resting casually on his radio. He was ready to call security if the old man became difficult, ready to escalate the situation if necessary. In his mind, this was a simple matter of protocol and procedure. Rules existed for a reason, and everyone, regardless of age or claimed service, had to follow them. Bill slowly pushed himself up from the bench, his joints creaking audibly in the humid air. He was tall, taller than he appeared when sitting, and despite his age, there was still strength in his frame, still power in his movements. He looked at each of the three operators in turn, his gaze steady and measuring. That tattoo on your arm, Kane said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. What unit was that? The Navy? Coast Guard? He made the words sound like profanity, like insults to be hurled rather than branches of service to be respected. Let me guess. You spent your whole deployment in some cushy office while real warriors like us were out there doing the hard work. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the confrontation like moths to a flame. There were enlisted soldiers, officers, civilian contractors, and military family members, all watching this drama unfold with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some of them recognized the old man from his weekly visits, knew him as Tommy's grandfather, knew him as a quiet, polite presence who never caused trouble. Bill looked down at his left forearm, at the edge of the tattoo that was barely visible beneath his sleeve. He hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't really looked at it in months. It was just part of him now, like a scar or a birthmark, something that existed without requiring attention or explanation. But as Kane's mocking words echoed in the air, as the crowd pressed closer with their curious stares, as the weight of assumption and dismissal settled over him like a heavy blanket, Bill felt something stir deep inside him. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was anger there. It wasn't pride, though pride was part of it too. It was something deeper, something that had been sleeping for decades and was now slowly, inevitably, beginning to wake up. He looked at Kane, at the Delta Force patch on his uniform, at the confidence and arrogance radiating from every line of his body. He looked at Rodriguez and Jackson, at their casual dismissal, their easy assumption of superiority. He looked at the crowd, at their expectant faces, their hunger for drama and resolution. And then, with movements as deliberate and measured as everything else he did, Bill Foster began to roll up his sleeve. The fabric moved slowly, revealing inch by inch what decades of silence had kept hidden. The crowd pressed closer, their casual interest transforming into something more intense, more focused. Kane's smirk faltered slightly as more of the tattoo became visible, though he couldn't yet make out the details. What started as a simple anchor began to reveal itself as something far more complex. The rope he had glimpsed wasn't rope at all, but rather the coiled tentacles of an octopus, its body wrapped around not just an anchor, but a submarine. Above it, barely visible through the faded ink, were the letters U, D, and T, arranged in a way that seemed almost casual, almost accidental, but carried a weight that few would recognize. Jackson was the first to notice something was wrong. His casual posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his hand moving away from his radio to hang loose at his side. He had spent enough time studying military history to recognize certain symbols, certain marks that carried significance far beyond their simple appearance. Rodriguez saw it too, though he couldn't quite place what was bothering him. There was something about the way the old man moved, something about the deliberate nature of his actions, that suggested this wasn't the reaction of a man being humiliated. This was the response of someone who had been pushed far enough, someone who was about to reveal a truth that would change everything. But Kane, still riding the wave of his own arrogance, pressed on. "Oh, this is rich," he said, his voice carrying across the patio like a whip crack. "Let me guess. You were on some supply ship somewhere, delivering mail and ice cream to the real fighters. That's what that is, right? Some kind of Navy support unit?" The words hit the air like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of discomfort among the gathered crowd. Several of the older military personnel shifted uneasily, their faces showing the first signs of recognition, the first understanding that this confrontation was about to take a very different turn. Bill continued rolling up his sleeve, his movements unhurried despite the mounting tension. The tattoo revealed itself in all its faded glory. The submarine now clearly visible, the octopus tentacles wrapping around it in an intricate dance of predator and machine. But it was the small details that began to tell the real story. The submarine wasn't just any submarine. It was a specific class, a specific design that hadn't been used since the 1960s. And around the base of the anchor, in letters so small they were almost invisible, were numbers. Coordinates. A master sergeant standing near the edge of the crowd took a step forward, his face pale with dawning realization. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, his training warring with his growing understanding of what he was witnessing. Bill's sleeve was now rolled up past his elbow, revealing the full extent of the artwork. But it wasn't just a tattoo anymore. It was a map, a record, a testament to missions that officially never happened, to places that didn't exist on any chart, to operations that were buried so deep in classified files that most people would never know they had occurred. Kane, still oblivious to the shift in the crowd's mood, took another step closer. "You know what I think, Pops? I think you're just another wannabe, another old man living in fantasies about service you never actually performed. That tattoo probably came from some parlor in Tijuana after you got drunk on shore leave." The insult cut through the air like a physical blow, and several members of the crowd audibly gasped. But Bill's expression didn't change. He simply finished rolling up his sleeve and stood there, his arm extended slightly, letting the afternoon sun illuminate every line, every detail, every carefully preserved memory etched into his skin. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with implications that most of the onlookers couldn't yet understand, but could definitely feel. It was the kind of silence that precedes revelation, the pause before truth crashes down like a tidal wave. Rodriguez was the first to break. His eyes had been studying the tattoo with growing alarm, and suddenly he grabbed Kane's arm, his grip tight with urgency. "Kane," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at the submarine. Really look at it." Kane glanced down dismissively, but as his eyes focused on the details of the artwork, his expression began to change. The submarine wasn't a modern nuclear vessel. It was something older, something smaller, something designed for a very specific type of mission. And those weren't decorative tentacles wrapped around it. They were operational tentacles, the kind used for very specialized underwater work. Jackson had gone completely still. His training finally connecting the dots his conscious mind had been struggling to piece together. He knew enough about special operations history to recognize what he was looking at, even if he couldn't quite believe it. His hand moved slowly to his radio, not to call security, but to access a different channel entirely, one reserved for situations that required immediate command attention. The crowd was growing restless, sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to grasp exactly what. Conversations died away, replaced by an expectant hush that seemed to press in from all sides. Even the normal sounds of the bass seemed muted, as if the entire installation was holding its breath. Bill looked at Kane, his pale blue eyes holding depths that suddenly seemed fathomless. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority it had held throughout the confrontation. But now there was something else underneath it. Something that made the hair on the back of Kane's neck stand up. "You asked about my service," Bill said, his words clear and measured. "You wanted to know about this tattoo." He gestured to his arm, to the intricate artwork that was now fully visible in the afternoon light. "You assumed it was something simple, something safe, something that fit your idea of what an old man's military experience should look like." Kane's mouth had gone dry, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could sense the shift in their mood, could practically taste the change in the air around him. But he was trapped now, committed to a course of action that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. Bill took a step closer, close enough that Kane could see the scars on his hands, the permanent stoop in his shoulders, the way his eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him. "This tattoo," he continued, his voice never rising above that same calm, conversational tone, "represents 37 missions between 1962 and 1968. Missions that took me places your GPS doesn't know exist. Places where the water is so cold it stops your heart, and the pressure is so great it crushes submarines like soda cans." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Whispers began to ripple through the gathered personnel, fragments of conversation that spoke of underwater demolition teams, of classified operations of programs so secret that their very existence was debated in intelligence circles. Rodriguez had released Kane's arm and taken a step back, his face a mask of professional horror. He knew enough about military history to understand what Bill was describing, knew enough about special operations to recognize the significance of those dates, those coordinates, that carefully preserved record of service that went far beyond anything he had ever experienced. Jackson's radio crackled to life, a voice on the other end requesting clarification of his earlier transmission. But he couldn't respond, couldn't find words to explain what was happening, what he was witnessing, what they had all stumbled into with their casual arrogance and easy assumptions. Kane stood frozen, his Delta Force patch suddenly feeling heavy on his sleeve, his confidence shattered like glass on concrete. He had pushed an old man, mocked his service, dismissed his sacrifice, and now the truth was staring him in the face with the implacable force of historical fact. But Bill wasn't finished. The 37th mission, Bill continued, his voice carrying across the silent patio like a prayer, was supposed to be reconnaissance only. He paused, his fingers tracing the faded lines of the submarine on his forearm. We went down in a vessel that officially never existed, to coordinates that were scrubbed from every chart the moment we surfaced. Kane's face had drained of all color. The smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked like fear, like the dawning realization that he had wandered into territory far beyond his understanding. His fellow operators stood motionless behind him, their earlier bravado transformed into stunned silence. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the gravity in Bill's voice, by the weight of words that carried the authority of lived experience rather than borrowed confidence. A colonel who had been walking past stopped mid-stride, his attention caught by something in the old man's tone that commanded respect. "We were supposed to observe and report," Bill said, his pale eyes distant now, looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. But when we got there, we found 17 of our boys trapped in a disabled research vessel, their air running out, their hull compromised. The water was 2 miles deep, the temperature was 34 degrees, and the nearest surface support was 18 hours away. We brought them all home. Bill's voice carried the finality of absolute truth. Every single one. And that submarine you're looking at? She never made it back to the surface. Neither did 3 of my teammates. Their names aren't on any memorial wall. Their families were told they died in training accidents, and their sacrifice remains buried in files so classified that presidents don't have clearance to read them. The silence stretched across the commissary patio like a physical presence. Kane's Delta Force patch, which had gleamed so proudly minutes before, now seemed to dim in the afternoon sun. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly. All his earlier arrogance evaporated like mist before the blazing truth of Bill's revelation. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension, heavy, purposeful, with the unmistakable cadence of senior command. The crowd parted instinctively as a figure emerged from the commissary doors. It was Brigadier General Morrison, the base commander, his weathered face set in lines of growing concern as he took in the scene before him. Morrison had been alerted by his aide, who had received an urgent call from Jackson's radio transmission. The general had expected to find a simple security incident, maybe an overzealous young operator flexing his authority. What he found instead was something that made his blood run cold. His eyes swept over the crowd, over the 3 frozen Delta operators, and finally settled on the old man standing quietly in their midst.